Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're going to be talking about one of the hardest books for me to review up to this point. Of the, over 150 reviews that I've done on this channel, Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton is probably going to be amongst the hardest reviews for me to actually do, because this sits in a really weird spot for recommending, which, kind of jumps the gun on a later section of the video, but it's pretty hard to recommend this book for several reasons, and also because the book's not amazing, but it's also not terrible. So there's a lot of complicated factors to Mickey 7 for me. So before we get too deep into any of those actual elements themselves, let's start off with the good of Mickey 7, some of the things that I do think are actually pretty solid and enjoyable, I guess. So first of all, I would say that Mickey 7 has a pretty fun concept. Expedition, space expeditions, colonizing planets is the basic conceit of this, but one of the members of this particular expedition, this particular colonization, features one member of the crew who can be revived, basically. It takes resources to be able to revive a person, but you can take somebody, you can basically take their entire essence, their entire being, be able to make that into a file that you can just print out a new body. And then there's also technology to be able to upload memories and basically the brain data of a person, and then be able to re-download that into a brain after the fact. So you have a person on the crew who's called an expendable, where their job basically is to do the very dangerous stuff, or the things that are basically guaranteed to kill a person, or most likely to kill a person, and then revive them after the fact. And that's basic core premise of the book, and I think that the concept is great. I would also say that Mickey 7 being very simple and quick to read makes this premise overall pretty low stakes. You combine that with the concept of a revivable protagonist, you get some stakes in the book, don't get me wrong, but overall the vibe is just kind of pretty chill, all things considered, for something that you might consider a colonization of a planet to be. You would think that would be pretty high stakes endeavor, and it is. Like I said, you do get some stakes in this book, but it feels pretty low stakes, and that makes it enjoyable to read for me. I also think that the ideas associated with some of these topics, like the revivification of a person and the inherent philosophy therein, I think that these things are handled surprisingly decently. For being so brief and entry level as a book, it's not a bad intro to some of the complex moral ideas of the nature of the conceit. It seems like something that's going to have a lot of question marks around it. That's absolutely the case, but Mickey 7 explores those ideas surprisingly well, again, for being so short as it is. In addition, I would also say that these kinds of ideas open up the book to containing backstory, general sort of lore of the universe. That's pretty enjoyable. In fact, throughout the book, you have various segments of kind of world building and history of certain other colonies within the galaxy, I suppose. That material is actually super solid. It genuinely adds to the story itself, rather than just being random exposition or random lore that feels unnecessary. It actually feels like it's relevant. It's always bringing up something contextually meaningful to the active plot of the book. So even the material that isn't following the active timeline is really good in that way. I would also say that the dynamic between various pairs of characters is pretty satisfying on a general level, given the lack of time to be able to make some more deep character development possible. As such, the characters of the book are pretty decent, again, considering how short and entry level the book is intended to be. In fact, the events of the story actually kind of matter in some tangible sense to the way that the characters go, most especially in cases like Cat, things like, what is it called? For whatever reason, I'm forgetting the term, but it's called survivor's guilt. But if that's not the technical term, you know what it is I'm referring to. You have ideas like these intermixed with the ideas of reviving a person that are core to the novel. And surprisingly, these thematic ideas are actually pretty decently explored in Mickey 7, in my opinion. though it's pretty basic overall, it's still satisfying, even so far as like the antagonist of the book being convincing enough to serve its purpose. Again, the some of it's pretty simple, some of it's pretty basic. It's not the deepest in the world, but it serves its purpose, and it does so surprisingly well. I would also say that the confrontations throughout the book with the antagonist specifically, as far as we're on that, topic, especially at the end of the book, these interactions, these confrontations, like I said, come off as actually genuine and realistic conflict to me, and that's pretty hard to do as kind of a general rule, but in something as short as this, it's less than 300 pages in the hardback. That's actually rather impressive. I also liked how quickly and suddenly everything kind of starts to fall apart for the protagonist. It's much more believable this way. The book is it's not super distracting. You're not like, oh, there's no way they're getting away with this at this time or whatever. No, like you're actually seeing things very slowly start to fall apart insofar as the core premise is concerned. And it's great. I actually thought that was pretty good material. But with all that being said, Mickey 7 isn't fantastic. So for the bad, we're going to talk about how several of the strengths of the novel are also weaknesses of it. So the concept is fun, but there's not much actual plot of the book. I kind of talked about this stuff being solidly explored, but a lot of it's more solid in the way that it kind of props up the way that certain thematic ideas are built and explored. The actual plot of the book itself isn't really there. Like, there is a plot, but it's not really the main focus for the majority of the book, to the degree that like the last third of the book, when the actual plot kind of matters the most, when it is like the most forward thing, is actually the most mediocre portion of the book, the last third. So that kind of says something, in my opinion. That last act is definitely the weakest for me. Although the philosophy is interesting in the book as well, it is interesting as more of a baseline entry level degree. That's not to say that it's super shallow or that it's not explored to enough depth, because for the purpose of the story, I think it's explored pretty decently. But again, it's more or less a baseline entry level degree. And if you've read a bunch of stuff that deals with any of these kinds of ideas in the past, you've probably read a bunch of things that have explored those ideas deeper. And therefore you might be dissatisfied with the level that Mickey 7 tries to explore them. And in the book's defense, I would say that obviously it's kind of meant to be beginner level, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Furthermore, I would say that while I think the characters are by and large pretty decent, they're also not super likable, and so therefore a lot of people probably just aren't going to really connect to them at all. I think you can empathize with Kat largely. I personally liked Mickey 7. Didn't really like Mickey 8 as much, but Mickey 8's depiction in the book is nowhere near as bad as like Mickey 18 in the movie version of this. Nasha as a character is, she exists. Not bad, not good either way. I think Birdo's a prick, however. And Marshall, the antagonist, is admittedly somewhat one-dimensional, even though I think that the purpose that he serves in the story is solid. All the characters, I think, actually do serve their purpose pretty well, and they aren't bad characters, in my opinion, but they're also not super memorable, to the point that, like, I very much struggle to remember Birdo's name at all without having it noted down somewhere. When I was watching the movie, I couldn't recall in the movie, the character is Timo, but I couldn't remember what the book counterpart's name was the entire time that I was watching the movie and afterwards, because he's not super memorable in that way. So like there's a little bit of weakness associated with the characters there. I would also say that, as I hinted earlier, the final act, the climax of the book, is by far the most mediocre part of the book, not least because the way that the creepers, the way that aspect of the story evolves isn't very convincing to me. It felt a little bit too much like a cop-out compared to most other facets of the book, which are surprisingly solid. It's not horribly offensive, but it's also not super amazing. In the book's defense, it's also a lot better. The climax is a lot better than the climax of the movie, but again, it's still not great. At least it's internally consistent, unlike the climax of the movie. But yeah, the ugly for Mickey 7 is, well, let's just say we're kind of brushing up against the recommendation for this one. because it's kind of hard to really like talk about certain aspects of this book without getting into why it's difficult to recommend or not. And I would say that is because this book is basically baby's first Andy Weir. And if you know anything about Andy Weir, you know that Andy Weir is already baby's first sci-fi. He's already a pretty entry-level author within the genre. This isn't a bad thing, but Mickey 7 is like an entry-level to even Andy Weir's level of sci-fi. And for people who read a bunch of sci-fi, even this realm that Andy Weir kind of takes up is not wholly representative of sci-fi as a genre. So if you're using it to get into sci-fi, it's not exactly the most helpful. It's kind of its own thing. It uses sci-fi stuff, but it's not really representative of the genre at large. I would also say that given some of the sexual content and language of Mickey 7, though not super graphic, it's not like you can give this book to kids, you know? It's, like I said, it's not even that it's excessively graphic in any way, shape, or form, but it's too graphic for like middle schoolers who this book would otherwise be pretty perfect for. You know, maybe like young high schoolers would make a good demographic for Mickey 7, but young high schoolers would also be a pretty good demographic for Andy Weir as a rule as well. I mean, as long as they're not offended by too much language or anything, The Martian is a much better book in this kind of degree than Mickey 7 is. And for that matter, Project Hail Mary is just as good as The Martian in a lot of ways and better in a couple of other ways and has a lot less language as well. So in that way, Project Hail Mary makes a much better book to recommend to somebody that age than Mickey 7 does. And Mickey 7 actually, ironically, is kind of like an alternate universe version of Artemis in some weird ways. That's not necessarily a dig at it because I know a lot of people don't like Artemis. I actually remember liking Artemis. I think it's underrated or at the very least overhated. Mickey 7 just falls in a weird place of being kind of like in that Andy Weir sphere of things, and realizing this, looking like skimming over the first couple of pages before I started reading it, I was like, this looks like it's probably going to be kind of that realm. And because I was expecting that, I therefore enjoyed it as that kind of easy, you know, entry level type of thing. But if you're going into it for any other reason, or if you've already read all of Weir, like, I don't think that this book's necessarily going to do a whole lot for you. So for the actual recommendation itself, the ugly and the recommendation together here basically say the same thing. This book is perfectly serviceable as entry-level sci-fi in the realm that Andy Weir kind of also resides in, but it's not really anything more than that. If you go into the book knowing what that is, you might enjoy it like I did. I largely did enjoy Mickey 7. But if you're a huge sci-fi nut, this definitely won't do anything for you, and if anything, you will find it shallow, even though it's just kind of an early stage for the ideas, which, again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's perfectly serviceable as entry-level sci-fi, but Andy Weir is much more serviceable, where Mickey 7 is fine, and it's doing what it's doing pretty decently, surprisingly decently. In fact, Andy Weir is pretty fantastic, actually, especially The Martian. I think The Martian is like a perfect book. So in that kind of realm, it's kind of hard to compete with somebody who already does it so well, and that is what this book kind of feels like it's doing. So in total, I don't really recommend Mickey 7, but I also don't not recommend it. You know, like it's kind of in that space between like I do or I don't, and it's not either of those things. I think that you personally should make that decision for yourself. It's baby's first Andy Weir, which is cool, and I know I'm beating a dead horse with this, but as long as you go into it knowing that it's not necessarily as good as Weir is, cool. But again, I'm not going to say don't read this book either, because it's not bad or unenjoyable. And that's basically how I feel about Mickey 7. If you want to know more about how I thought about Mickey 17, the movie inspired by the book, basically an adaptation of the book, you can check that out on the second channel. Actually, I have a probably pretty lengthy written review that I scripted and put over there. And, well, yeah, check that out if you want to see why I really don't recommend the movie. And if you're going to pick between one or the other, read the book before you watch the movie, hands down. But yeah, that's just my general opinion here. If you did read it, I hope you enjoyed it, but I know plenty of people who didn't really enjoy it very much. So let me know if you've read the book. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.